For 50 years, everyone in Boston, Massachusetts, thought they knew who killed Sarah Fitzgerald. They were all wrong. The autumn leaves crunched beneath Detective Maria Santos's boots as she walked across the campus of Boston College, a small, liberal arts institution nestled in the Berkshire Mountains, where time seemed to move slower than the rest of the world. The brick buildings, covered in ivy that had turned crimson and gold, stood as silent witnesses to a tragedy that had haunted this peaceful community since 1971. If you're drawn to stories of justice finally served after decades of silence, make sure to subscribe to our channel, because Sarah's case is just one of many cold cases we're bringing back into the light. Sarah Elizabeth Fitzgerald was everything a small New England college could have asked for in a student. 22 years old, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had never known real hardship. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight streaming through the tall windows of Thornton Hall, where she spent most of her time buried in psychology textbooks and research papers, the daughter of a prominent Boston attorney and a classical pianist. Sarah had grown up in a world of privilege, but those who knew her best remembered her genuine kindness more than her family's wealth. Professor Harold Mitchell, who taught her advanced abnormal psychology course, would later tell investigators that Sarah possessed an unusual gift for understanding the human mind. She could read people, he said, in ways that made her classmates both admire and slightly fear her insight. Her thesis on criminal psychology and deviant behavior had impressed the faculty so much that Harvard's graduate program had already extended her an acceptance letter for the following fall. But it was Sarah's compassion that truly set her apart. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, she volunteered at the Boston Community Center, teaching literacy to local factory workers who had never learned to read properly. Mrs. Eleanor Dubois, the center's coordinator, remembered how Sarah never looked at her watch during those sessions, how she'd stay late if someone was struggling with a particularly difficult passage, her voice patient and encouraging even when exhaustion shadowed her green eyes. The weekend before her death, Sarah had seemed different to her roommate, Jennifer Walsh. They had shared room 314 in Morrison Dormitory since their sophomore year, and Jennifer knew Sarah's moods better than anyone. There was a nervous energy about her that final weekend, an unusual restlessness that kept her pacing their small room late into the night. When Jennifer asked what was troubling her, Sarah had simply smiled and said she was working on something important, something that might help a lot of people. Sunday, October 17th, 1971, dawned crisp and clear, the kind of New England morning that made students grateful they had chosen a school surrounded by mountains rather than city streets. The campus chapel bells were ringing for the 8 a.m. service when Margaret Costa, the dormitory housekeeper, climbed the stairs to the third floor of Morrison Hall with her usual cart of cleaning supplies. She had been working at the college for 15 years, long enough to know which students kept tidy rooms and which ones lived in creative chaos. Sarah's room was always immaculate, which is why Mrs. Costa immediately noticed the door standing slightly ajar. In all her years of cleaning that dormitory, Sarah had never left her door unlocked, let alone open. The silence that greeted her gentle knock felt different from the usual quiet of a student sleeping in on Sunday morning. It felt empty, somehow. Wrong. Mrs. Costa's scream echoed through the third-floor corridor of Morrison Hall at 8:47 a.m., a sound so piercing and raw that students 3 floors below stopped their Sunday morning conversations to listen. By the time the first campus security officer arrived, a small crowd had gathered in the hallway, their faces pale and confused as they stared at the partially open door of room 314. Sarah Fitzgerald lay on her narrow dormitory bed, still dressed in the yellow cotton nightgown she had worn to sleep. Her auburn hair fanned across the white pillowcase like spilled wine, and her green eyes stared sightlessly at the ceiling. The room itself told a story that made no sense to anyone who examined it that morning, a puzzle of contradictions that would torment investigators for the next 50 years. Sheriff Thomas Keller, a man more accustomed to handling drunk college students and minor theft cases, found himself standing in the doorway of what would become the most baffling crime scene of his 30-year career. Nothing appeared disturbed. Sarah's textbooks lay open on her desk, exactly where she had left them. A psychology journal still turned to an article about antisocial personality disorders. Her fountain pen rested beside a half-completed essay, the ink still wet enough to smudge, when Deputy Robert Lemoyne accidentally brushed against it with his sleeve. The single overturned coffee cup on the windowsill would become the detail that haunted every investigator who worked the case. The porcelain cup, decorated with small blue flowers, had fallen onto the radiator below, leaving a brown stain that Mrs. Costa would scrub unsuccessfully for weeks after the investigation concluded. But Sarah never drank coffee. Everyone who knew her could attest to that fact. She was particular about it, almost prideful in her abstinence from caffeine, preferring herbal teas that she brewed in a small electric kettle her mother had given her. Dr. William Fraser, the county medical examiner, arrived from Springfield at 11:30 a.m., his black medical bag looking oddly outdated against the youthful atmosphere of the college dormitory. His preliminary examination revealed ligature marks around Sarah's neck, consistent with manual strangulation, but the positioning of her body suggested she had been arranged post-mortem. Her arms were folded across her chest in an almost peaceful pose, her nightgown straightened and smoothed with careful attention to modesty. The lack of defensive wounds puzzled Dr. Fraser most of all. Sarah's fingernails were clean, unbroken, showing no signs that she had fought her attacker. There were no scratches on her arms, no bruising on her hands that might indicate she had tried to pull away from the ligature around her throat. It was as if she had simply lain there and allowed herself to be killed, which Dr. Fraser knew from 20 years of experience was impossible unless she had been incapacitated first. More disturbing still was the evidence that someone had been in the room after Sarah's death. The small electric kettle had been used recently enough that it was still warm to the touch when investigators arrived. A single teacup sat in the small sink, rinsed clean but still damp. Someone had made tea in that room while Sarah's body lay cooling on the bed just 6 feet away. Deputy Lemoyne found the most chilling detail while photographing the scene. On Sarah's desk, beneath her psychology textbook, lay her daily planner, opened to Sunday, October 17th. In her careful handwriting, she had written a single appointment. 7:30 p.m. Tell the truth. Below that, in different ink and what appeared to be a different hand entirely, someone had crossed out the entry and written in block letters, "Truth told." The investigation team collected what physical evidence they could with the limited forensic capabilities available in 1971. Fingerprints lifted from the door handle, the teacup, and the overturned coffee cup would eventually prove to match only Sarah, her roommate Jennifer, and Mrs. Costa. Hair samples and fabric fibers were carefully bagged and labeled, then stored in the basement of the Berkshire County courthouse, where they would remain untouched for nearly 5 decades. Sheriff Thomas Keller had investigated exactly 3 homicides in his 30 years of law enforcement, and none of them had prepared him for the complexity that Sarah Fitzgerald's case would present. The other murders had been straightforward affairs, a domestic dispute that turned deadly, a bar fight gone too far, and a robbery that ended in tragedy. In each case, the perpetrator was obvious, the motive clear, and the evidence abundant. Sarah's case was different. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing and no picture on the box to guide him. The pressure began almost immediately. By Monday morning, less than 24 hours after Sarah's body was discovered, Keller's small office was flooded with phone calls. Arthur Fitzgerald, Sarah's father, had already contacted the Massachusetts State Police, the FBI, and every political connection his law firm had cultivated over the decades. His voice carried the commanding tone of a man accustomed to getting results, but beneath the authority, Keller could hear something else. The desperate panic of a father who had lost his only child. College president Dr. Harold Weber made his position clear during a tense meeting in his mahogany-paneled office that Tuesday afternoon. The college's reputation was at stake, he explained to Sheriff Keller, speaking in the measured tones of an academic who chose his words carefully. Parents were already calling, concerned about their children's safety. The Board of Trustees was asking uncomfortable questions about campus security. The local media had begun sniffing around, and it was only a matter of time before the Boston papers picked up the story. Weber never explicitly said the words, but his message was unmistakable. Solve this quickly and quietly, or find yourself looking for a new job. The forensic capabilities available to Keller's department in 1971 were primitive by any standard. Blood typing was the most sophisticated analysis they could perform, and even that required sending samples to the state laboratory in Springfield, where the backlog meant waiting weeks for results. Fingerprint analysis was limited to what could be seen with the naked eye and a magnifying glass. DNA testing wouldn't be available for criminal investigations for another 15 years, making the biological evidence collected from Sarah's room virtually useless with the technology of the time. Deputy Robert Lemoyne spent countless hours interviewing Sarah's friends, professors, and acquaintances, filling notebook after notebook with testimonies that revealed a young woman beloved by everyone who knew her. But love, Lemoyne was learning, was not always protection from evil. Every person he spoke with seemed genuinely shocked by Sarah's death, genuinely bewildered by who might want to harm her. The interviews yielded no obvious suspects, no clear motives, and no witnesses who had seen or heard anything unusual on that Sunday morning. The investigation's first major setback came when the Massachusetts State Police Crime Scene Unit finally arrived to process Sarah's dormitory room. By then, the scene had been contaminated by well-meaning campus security officers, curious students who had gathered in the hallway, and college maintenance workers who had been asked to repair the lock on the door. Critical evidence may have been destroyed or overlooked in those crucial first hours when protocol had given way to panic and confusion. Dr. William Fraser's full autopsy report, completed 2 weeks after Sarah's death, raised more questions than it answered. The cause of death was manual strangulation, but the killer had possessed unusual strength and knowledge of anatomy. The pressure had been applied to specific points on Sarah's throat with surgical precision, suggesting either medical training or extensive anatomical knowledge. More puzzling still, toxicology tests revealed trace amounts of a mild sedative in Sarah's blood, not enough to cause unconsciousness, but sufficient to make her drowsy and less likely to fight back. As autumn turned to winter, the leads dried up one by one. The mysterious coffee cup yielded no usable fingerprints. The appointment notation in Sarah's planner, "Tell the truth," remained unexplained despite extensive investigation into her academic work, personal relationships, and volunteer activities. The fabric fibers collected from her fingernails were too degraded to provide meaningful analysis with 1971 technology. By Christmas of that year, the investigation had effectively stalled. Sheriff Keller found himself returning to the evidence room again and again, staring at the boxes of collected materials as if they might suddenly reveal their secrets. The case file grew thicker with dead-end leads and inconclusive reports, but the central mystery remained as impenetrable as ever. The basement of the Berkshire County courthouse had always been a place where cases went to die. Rows of metal shelving stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with cardboard boxes that contained the detritus of decades of investigations. Water stains on the concrete walls told the story of numerous floods, and the musty smell of old paper and mildew permeated everything. It was here, in this forgotten archive, that the key to Sarah Fitzgerald's murder would wait for nearly 50 years. Evidence clerk Martha Pereira had worked in that basement for 23 years, long enough to know every box, every file, and every cold case that had been consigned to storage. She had started working for the county in 1978, 7 years after Sarah's death, but she had heard the older deputies talk about the college girl's murder in hushed tones. It was the case that had broken Sheriff Keller, they said. The one that had turned his hair grey and put deep lines around his eyes. The box labelled Fitzgerald, Sarah E., case No. 710847, sat on shelf 7C, wedged between a 1969 arson case and a 1973 missing person file that had been solved decades earlier. Inside, carefully catalogued according to the standards of 1971, were the physical remnants of an investigation that had consumed an entire police department for months. Crime scene photographs, witness statements, autopsy reports, and evidence bags filled with items that had seemed crucial at the time but had yielded no answers. Among these forgotten artifacts was a small manila envelope, no larger than a greeting card, sealed with evidence tape that had yellowed and cracked with age. The handwritten label, faded but still legible, read, "Fingernail scrapings victim collected 10/17/71. Inside the envelope, wrapped in tissue paper, were tiny fragments of skin and blood that Dr. Fraser had carefully removed from beneath Sarah's fingernails during the autopsy. At the time, the samples had been considered potentially significant, but without the technology to analyze them properly, they had been filed away and forgotten. A second envelope, slightly larger, contained a single thread of fabric that Deputy Lemoyne had found caught on the window latch in Sarah's dormitory room. The thread was dark blue, possibly from a wool sweater or jacket, and it hadn't matched any clothing found in Sarah's wardrobe or her roommate's belongings. In 1971, fiber analysis was limited to visual comparison and basic microscopy. The thread had been photographed, measured, and stored, but it had provided no leads and eventually been relegated to the growing pile of inconclusive evidence. Perhaps most significantly, tucked into a corner of the evidence box, was a small glass vial containing what the label identified as foreign saliva sample, recovered from victim's neck area. Dr. Fraser had been thorough in his collection of biological evidence, swabbing areas around the ligature marks where the killer might have left traces of DNA. In 1971, saliva was useful only for blood typing, and the sample had been too small and degraded to yield even that basic information. The evidence box also contained something that had seemed insignificant at the time, a single coffee filter, stained brown and torn, that had been found in the wastebasket of Sarah's room. Given that Sarah didn't drink coffee, investigators had noted its presence but couldn't explain its significance. The filter had been bagged and stored with everything else, a minor mystery within the greater puzzle of Sarah's death. Martha Pereira had always been meticulous about environmental controls in the evidence storage area. Despite the building's age and the less-than-ideal conditions, she had fought for better shelving, humidity controls, and temperature regulation. Her efforts had been largely successful, and many of the biological samples stored in her care had been preserved far better than anyone could have expected. The cold, dry conditions of the basement had acted as an inadvertent preservation chamber, keeping DNA intact in ways that wouldn't be discovered until genetic testing became available decades later. Over the years, Martha had watched forensic science evolve from the crude techniques of the 1970s to the sophisticated analyses possible by the turn of the century. She had seen other cold cases reopened and solved as new technologies became available, but Sarah Fitzgerald's case remained untouched. The college girl's murder had become one of those legendary unsolved mysteries that older officers would mention to rookies as an example of how some cases simply couldn't be cracked. By 2019, when Detective Maria Santos first descended those basement stairs, many of the original investigators were dead or retired. The evidence box sat exactly where Martha Pereira had placed it decades earlier, a time capsule containing the preserved fragments of a young woman's final moments, and, unknown to anyone at the time, the genetic fingerprint of her killer. Detective Maria Santos had never intended to become obsessed with dead girls, but by 2019, the ghosts of unsolved cases had become her constant companions. She carried their stories in manila folders that never quite fit properly in her desk drawer, their faces staring up at her from crime scene photographs that she studied during lunch breaks and late nights when sleep refused to come. Sarah Fitzgerald's case found its way onto her desk on a rainy Thursday in March, 48 years after that Sunday morning in Morrison Hall. The Berkshire County Sheriff's Department had undergone significant changes since Thomas Keller's retirement in 1987. Modern forensic capabilities, computer databases, and a dedicated cold case unit had transformed what was once a small-town law enforcement agency into a sophisticated operation. Santos had joined the department 5 years earlier after a decorated career with the Massachusetts State Police, bringing with her a reputation for solving seemingly impossible cases through sheer persistence and an intuitive understanding of criminal psychology. But Sarah's case was different from the others that crossed Santos's desk. As she sat in the courthouse basement, carefully examining the evidence that Martha Pereira had preserved for nearly 5 decades, she felt a familiar chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The crime scene photographs showed a young woman who could have been her own daughter if she had been blessed with children. Sarah's peaceful expression in death, the careful arrangement of her body, and the inexplicable presence of that coffee cup created a tableau that seemed almost ritualistic in its precision. Santos had grown up just 30 miles from Boston, in a family where education was revered and college represented the ultimate achievement. Her own mother had worked 2 jobs to send her to the University of Massachusetts, sacrificing everything so her daughter could have opportunities she'd never known. When Santos looked at Sarah Fitzgerald's transcripts, her volunteer work records, and the letters of recommendation from professors, she saw not just a victim, but a symbol of everything her own family had struggled to achieve. The personal connection deepened as Santos interviewed Sarah's surviving family members. Arthur Fitzgerald, now 87 and confined to a wheelchair in an assisted living facility outside Boston, still spoke about his daughter with a mixture of pride and devastating grief that made Santos's chest tighten with emotion. His wife, Sarah's mother, had died in 1995, taking with her a mother's desperate hope that someday, somehow, justice would be served. Arthur's hands shook as he showed Santos the photograph he kept on his bedside table. Sarah in her graduation gown, smiling with the confidence of someone who believed the future held infinite possibilities. Jennifer Walsh, Sarah's former roommate, had built a successful career as a psychologist in Vermont, but the shadow of that October morning had never left her. During their interview in Walsh's comfortable suburban home, Santos watched as the composed professional facade crumbled, revealing a woman who had spent 5 decades wondering if she could have prevented her best friend's death. Walsh had returned from a weekend visit with her parents just 2 hours after Sarah's body was discovered, a timing that had saved her from becoming either a witness or a second victim. The most haunting aspect of Santos's investigation was discovering how thoroughly Sarah's murder had been forgotten by the wider world. The college had memorialized her with a small plaque in the psychology building, but most current students had never heard her name. The case files contained dozens of interviews with people who were now in their 70s, if they were still alive at all. Time had erased not just the physical evidence, but the living memory of a crime that had once shattered an entire community. Santos found herself working on Sarah's case during evenings and weekends, driven by something deeper than professional obligation. She had solved other cold cases through methodical investigation and modern forensic techniques, but this one felt personal in a way she couldn't fully explain. Perhaps it was the waste of potential that Sarah's death represented, or the image of Arthur Fitzgerald waiting alone in his assisted living facility for answers that might never come. The breakthrough that would finally unlock Sarah Fitzgerald's case began not in a laboratory or police station, but in the suburban living room of a genealogy enthusiast named Patricia Moore, who had been researching her family tree as a retirement hobby. Moore had uploaded her DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public database used by millions of people seeking to trace their ancestry, never imagining that her genetic information would eventually help solve a 48-year-old murder. Detective Santos had partnered with C.C. Moore, a genetic genealogist whose work had revolutionized cold case investigations across the country. The technique, known as investigative genetic genealogy, used DNA profiles from crime scenes to identify potential suspects through their relatives who had submitted their DNA to public genealogy databases. It was painstaking work that could take months of analysis, but it had already solved dozens of cases that had seemed hopeless using traditional investigative methods. The process began when Santos submitted the preserved biological evidence from Sarah's case to Othram, a specialized laboratory in Texas that could extract usable DNA profiles from even severely degraded samples. The fingernail scrapings that Dr. Fraser had collected in 1971, stored in that manila envelope for nearly 5 decades, contained enough genetic material to create a comprehensive profile of Sarah's killer. The saliva sample from her neck area provided additional confirmation, creating a genetic fingerprint that was as unique as the killer himself. Dr. David Mittelman, Othram's founder, had seen hundreds of these cases, but Sarah's evidence was remarkably well preserved considering its age. The cold, dry conditions in the courthouse basement had protected the DNA from the degradation that typically occurred over decades. Within 6 weeks, his laboratory had generated a complete genetic profile that could be compared against the millions of DNA samples in genealogy databases. The first match appeared in March 2020, just as the COVID-19 pandemic was shutting down much of the world. A man named Robert Volkoff, who lived in Oregon and had never heard of Sarah Fitzgerald, had uploaded his DNA to GEDmatch while researching his Eastern European roots. His genetic profile indicated that he was a second cousin to whoever had left their DNA under Sarah's fingernails. The connection was distant, but significant enough to begin building a family tree that might lead to the killer. C.C. Moore spent the next 4 months constructing elaborate genealogical charts, tracing the Volkoff family lineage back 3 generations to identify all possible relatives who could have been living in Massachusetts in 1971. The work was methodical and exhausting, requiring her to search through birth certificates, death records, census data, and newspaper archives to track the movements of dozens of family members across multiple states and decades. The breakthrough came when Moore discovered that Robert Volkoff's great-uncle, Vladimir Petrov, had moved from Boston to the Berkshire County area in 1969, taking a job as a maintenance supervisor at Boston College. Petrov had been 43 years old in 1971, married with 2 children, and by all accounts, a respected member of the community. His employment record showed that he had access to every building on campus, including the dormitories, and his work schedule placed him on campus the weekend of Sarah's murder, but Vladimir Petrov had died in 1994, taking whatever secrets he might have possessed to his grave. His obituary described a man who had worked at the college for 25 years before retiring, who had been active in his Orthodox church, and who had left behind a widow and 2 adult children. There was nothing in the public record to suggest that he had ever been suspected of any crime, let alone murder. Santos felt the familiar mixture of excitement and frustration that came with every major breakthrough in a cold case. The DNA evidence strongly suggested that Vladimir Petrov was Sarah's killer, but proving it would require additional genetic comparisons from his direct descendants. More challenging still would be establishing motive and opportunity, piecing together the events of that October morning from fragments of memory and decades-old evidence. The genetic genealogy had provided a name, but it had also raised new questions that would prove even more disturbing than the original mystery. If Vladimir Petrov had indeed killed Sarah Fitzgerald, how had he evaded suspicion for so long? And perhaps most chilling of all, had Sarah been his only victim? The confirmation that Detective Santos needed came from an unexpected source. A shoebox full of old photographs discovered in the attic of Vladimir Petrov's former home. His daughter, Eleanor Thompson, had been cleaning out the property after her mother's death when she found the collection hidden beneath decades of dust and insulation. The photographs, dating back to the late 1960s and early 1970s, showed a side of her father that she had never known existed. Eleanor had agreed to provide a DNA sample after Santos contacted her in the summer of 2020, though she remained skeptical that her mild-mannered father could have been involved in any serious crime. Vladimir Petrov had been a devoted family man, she insisted, someone who never missed her school plays or soccer games, who taught Sunday school at the Orthodox Church, and who had built her a treehouse that still stood in the backyard of her childhood home. The idea that this gentle giant of a man could have murdered a college student seemed impossible to her. But the photographs told a different story. Mixed in with innocent family snapshots were dozens of images that Elena had never seen before, pictures that her father had apparently taken in secret around the Boston College campus. Female students walking to class, studying in the library, eating lunch in the cafeteria. The photographs were taken from a distance, often from behind trees or through windows, with the careful composition of someone who had been watching and waiting for the perfect moment. Most disturbing of all was a series of photographs that appeared to have been taken in the weeks leading up to Sarah's murder. The images showed Sarah leaving her dormitory, walking across campus, sitting on a bench outside the psychology building reading a textbook. The final photograph in the sequence was taken through the window of Morrison Hall, showing Sarah at her desk in room 314, completely unaware that she was being watched. The date stamp on the camera indicated it had been taken just 3 days before her death. When the DNA results came back from the Massachusetts State Police Laboratory, they confirmed what Santos had already begun to suspect. Vladimir Petrov was a direct genetic match to the biological evidence found under Sarah's fingernails and in the saliva sample taken from her neck. The probability of the match being coincidental was less than 1 in a trillion, making it as close to absolute certainty as forensic science could provide. Elena Thompson's world collapsed in the space of a single phone call. The father she had idealized, the man whose memory she had cherished for 26 years since his death, was revealed to be a predator who had stalked and murdered an innocent young woman. The realization that she had lived her entire adult life defending the reputation of a killer left her feeling complicit in a crime she had never known was committed. The community of Boston struggled to process the revelation. Vladimir Petrov had been a fixture in the town for over 2 decades after Sarah's murder, living and working among the very people who mourned her death. He had attended memorial services, contributed to scholarship funds established in Sarah's name, and expressed sympathy to her family members when their paths crossed at community events. The audacity of his deception was breathtaking in its cruelty. Former colleagues at Boston College remembered Petrov as a quiet, reliable employee who took pride in maintaining the campus buildings and grounds. He had keys to every dormitory, access to student records through his administrative duties, and the trust of faculty and students who saw him as a benign presence in their daily lives. Professor Harold Mitchell, who had taught Sarah's advanced abnormal psychology course, recalled numerous conversations with Petrov about campus security and student safety, discussions that now took on a sinister significance. The investigation revealed that Petrov had been present on campus the morning Sarah's body was discovered, part of the maintenance crew that had been called in to assist with securing the crime scene. He had stood in the hallway of Morrison Hall, just feet from the room where he had committed murder, watching as investigators collected evidence that would eventually lead back to him. The boldness of his behavior suggested a level of confidence that chilled Santos to her core. As Detective Santos delved deeper into Vladimir Petrov's life, a pattern of calculated deception began to emerge that stretched far beyond Sarah Fitzgerald's murder. The man who had presented himself as a devoted husband and father had been living a double life of stunning complexity, one that required constant vigilance to maintain and an almost sociopathic ability to compartmentalize his actions. Employment records from Boston College revealed that Petrov had specifically requested assignments that gave him access to the female dormitories. He had volunteered for night shifts and weekend maintenance duties, times when fewer staff members were present and students were more vulnerable. His supervisor, James O'Connor, remembered that Petrov often worked alone and preferred it that way, claiming he was more efficient without the distraction of other workers. What O'Connor hadn't realized was that this isolation gave Petrov the freedom to pursue his darker interests. The discovery of Petrov's personal effects, stored in his widow's garage for decades, painted a picture of obsessive behavior that had escalated over many years. Among his tools and work equipment, investigators found a collection of master keys that had been reported missing from the college's security office in 1970. Petrov had apparently duplicated them, giving himself unrestricted access to campus buildings long after his official duties required it. He had also maintained detailed schedules of student activities, noting when particular dormitories would be largely empty and which students had predictable routines. More troubling still were the journals that Petrov had kept, written in a mixture of English and what appeared to be coded Russian phrases. The entries, which began in 1969 and continued until just months before his death in 1994, documented his growing fixation with young women and his increasingly bold attempts to get close to them. He wrote about following students home, about learning their class schedules, about the intoxicating sense of power he felt when watching them without their knowledge. The journal entry dated October 15, 1971, just 2 days before Sarah's murder, was particularly chilling. Petrov had written about his frustration with a stubborn girl who had seen too much and needed to be taught a lesson. He described his plan in clinical detail, noting that Sunday mornings were ideal because most students slept late and the dormitories were quieter than usual. The entry concluded with a phrase that made Santos's blood run cold. "Some truths are too dangerous to tell." This reference to truth-telling connected directly to the cryptic appointment Sarah had written in her planner, "Tell the truth." Santos began to suspect that Sarah had discovered something about Petrov's activities, possibly witnessing him stalking other students or recognizing him from somewhere she shouldn't have seen him. The psychology student's keen insight into human behavior, the very gift that Professor Mitchell had praised, may have made her a threat that Petrov felt compelled to eliminate. As the investigation expanded, Santos began reaching out to other colleges in the region where Petrov had worked before coming to Boston. His employment history revealed a troubling pattern of short-term jobs at various educational institutions throughout Massachusetts and Vermont, positions he had left voluntarily and without explanation. At each school, there had been reports of missing keys, female students complaining about feeling watched, and in 2 cases, serious assaults that had never been solved. The most disturbing discovery came when Santos contacted the Vermont State Police about an unsolved murder from 1967. Linda Hamilton, a 19-year-old student at Middlebury College, had been found strangled in her dormitory room during Christmas break when the campus was nearly deserted. The crime scene had been remarkably similar to Sarah's, No signs of forced entry, the victim's body carefully arranged, and evidence that someone had remained in the room after the murder. Vladimir Petrov had been employed as a groundskeeper at Middlebury College from September 1966 until January 1968, leaving his position just weeks after Linda's death. The realization that Sarah Fitzgerald might have been one victim among many added a new dimension of horror to the case. Santos began compiling a timeline of Petrov's movements over his entire adult life, cross-referencing his employment history with unsolved crimes against young women in each area where he had lived and worked. The pattern that emerged suggested a predator who had been active for decades, someone who had perfected his methods through practice and had learned to avoid suspicion by constantly changing locations. The scope of Petrov's potential crimes raised questions that extended far beyond Sarah's murder. How many other families had spent decades wondering what had happened to their daughters? How many other cases had gone cold because investigators had never thought to look at the quiet maintenance worker who seemed so helpful and trustworthy? The arrest came not in Massachusetts, but in a quiet retirement community outside Phoenix, Arizona, where 81-year-old Dr. Marcus Sullivan had spent the last 15 years of his life believing that his darkest secret would die with him. Sullivan had been the resident physician at Boston College's health center in 1971, a position that had given him access to student medical records, dormitory buildings, and most importantly, the trust of young women who saw him as a figure of authority and protection. Detective Santos had spent months following the threads that connected Vladimir Petrov to a wider network of complicity, and Sullivan's name had appeared repeatedly in college employment records from the early 1970s. What initially seemed like routine administrative interactions between a maintenance worker and the campus doctor began to reveal a more sinister relationship when Santos discovered that Sullivan had been present at several of the colleges where Petrov had worked before arriving at Boston. The breakthrough in understanding Sullivan's role came when Santos located his former nurse, Catherine Rivera, who had worked at the Boston Health Center from 1968 to 1975. Rivera, now 78 and living in a nursing home in Springfield, had carried the weight of terrible knowledge for nearly 50 years. Her hands trembled as she told Santos about the unusual relationship between Dr. Sullivan and the maintenance supervisor, how they would meet in the health center after hours, speaking in hushed tones about students who had caused problems or needed to be monitored closely. Rivera remembered the Monday morning after Sarah's murder with crystalline clarity. Dr. Sullivan had arrived at the health center unusually early, his clothes disheveled and his hands shaking as he prepared what he claimed was medication for a student emergency. She had watched him dispose of several glass vials in the medical waste, an action that seemed odd at the time, but which she had convinced herself was routine. It wasn't until years later, after she had left the college and started working at Springfield General Hospital, that she realized the vials had likely contained sedatives that could have been used to incapacitate someone. The most damning evidence against Sullivan came from his own medical records, which Santos obtained through a court order after months of legal maneuvering. In 1994, the year of Vladimir Petrov's death, Sullivan had been admitted to a psychiatric facility in Boston following what his family described as a complete nervous breakdown. His medical files from that hospitalization contained notes from therapy sessions, where he had spoken obsessively about helping Vladimir and making sure the girls stayed quiet. The psychiatrist's notes indicated that Sullivan believed he was being watched by federal agents who knew about his involvement in serious crimes during his time at the college. The arrest warrant was issued on a cold February morning in 2021, 50 years and 4 months after Sarah Fitzgerald's murder. Santos flew to Phoenix with 2 FBI agents, knowing that confronting Sullivan would likely be her only opportunity to understand the full scope of what had happened at Boston College. She found him in the community garden behind his assisted living facility, tending to tomato plants with the careful attention of someone who had spent decades trying to nurture life as penance for having helped destroy it. Sullivan's reaction to seeing the badge was immediate and devastating. The color drained from his weathered face, and his knees buckled as if he had been waiting for this moment his entire adult life. He offered no resistance as the handcuffs were placed around his wrists, but his words to Santos would haunt her for months afterward. I tried to stop him after the first one, but he said he would tell everyone what I had done. I became a doctor to save lives, not to help take them. The details that emerged during Sullivan's interrogation painted a picture of coercion that had escalated into complicity over many years. Vladimir Petrov had discovered that Sullivan was writing illegal prescriptions for students, selling amphetamines and sedatives to help them stay awake for exams or sleep through anxiety. Rather than reporting the doctor, Petrov had used this knowledge as leverage, demanding that Sullivan provide him with drugs that could incapacitate victims and access to student medical files that helped him select targets. Sullivan's arrest sent shockwaves through the communities where he had lived and worked after leaving Boston. Former patients who had trusted him with their most intimate health concerns struggled to reconcile the caring physician they remembered with the man who had helped a serial killer select and subdue his victims. The medical establishment that had honored him with awards and distinguished service recognitions was forced to confront the possibility that they had been celebrating someone whose hands were stained with innocent blood. Most disturbing of all was Sullivan's revelation that Sarah Fitzgerald had not been Petrov's first victim at Boston College, nor would she have been his last if his death hadn't intervened. The doctor's guilty conscience had preserved detailed records of his involvement, kept hidden in a safety deposit box that would serve as both his insurance policy and his eventual confession. The trial of Dr. Marcus Sullivan began on October 17, 2021, exactly 50 years to the day after Sarah Fitzgerald's body was discovered in Morrison Hall. The timing was not coincidental. Berkshire County District Attorney Jennifer Burns had specifically requested that date, believing it would honor Sarah's memory and provide a sense of cosmic justice to the families who had waited half a century for answers. If you followed true crime cases like Sarah's and want to see more cold cases finally solved, subscribe to stay updated on these long-awaited breakthroughs in justice. Arthur Fitzgerald, now 88, was wheeled into the courtroom by his grandson, his frail body a testament to the decades he had spent waiting for this moment. The intervening years had taken their toll, but his eyes remained sharp and focused as he listened to Assistant District Attorney Michael Costa present evidence that finally explained what had happened to his daughter on that terrible Sunday morning in 1971. For Arthur, the trial represented not just legal proceedings, but the culmination of a promise he had made to his wife before her death, that he would live long enough to see justice served. Sullivan's defense attorney, Margaret Torres, faced an impossible task in trying to mitigate her client's guilt. The evidence was overwhelming, from the DNA matches that had identified Petrov as the killer to Sullivan's own recorded confessions about his role in enabling the murders. Her strategy focused on portraying Sullivan as another victim of Petrov's manipulation, a man whose initial crime of illegal prescription writing had spiraled into something far more terrible than he could have imagined. But the prosecution's case was methodical and devastating, presenting evidence that Sullivan had actively participated in stalking potential victims and had provided crucial assistance in planning their attacks. The most emotional testimony came from Elena Thompson, Vladimir Petrov's daughter, who took the witness stand to describe the devastating impact of learning that her father had been a serial killer. Her voice broke as she spoke about the photographs found in her father's possessions, images that showed he had been watching Sarah and other students for weeks before attacking them. The revelation had destroyed not only her memories of her father, but her ability to trust her own judgment about the people in her life. Catherine Rivera, now confined to a wheelchair but determined to tell her story, provided crucial testimony about the relationship between Petrov and Sullivan. Her account of the morning after Sarah's murder, when she had watched Sullivan dispose of suspicious medical supplies, helped establish the timeline of the conspiracy. Rivera's guilt over remaining silent for so long was palpable as she testified, her voice barely above a whisper as she described her failure to report what she had witnessed. The revelation of additional victims emerged during the trial proceedings, as investigators from multiple states presented evidence linking Petrov and Sullivan to at least 4 other unsolved murders of young women between 1967 and 1992. Linda Hamilton from Vermont, Patricia Gallagher from New Hampshire, Susan Hoffman from Connecticut, and Maria Gonzalez from Rhode Island had all been students at colleges, where Petrov had worked and Sullivan had maintained connections through medical conferences and consulting arrangements. Each family's story added another layer of tragedy to the proceedings. Parents who had died without knowing what happened to their daughters, siblings who had spent decades wondering if their loved ones might still be alive somewhere, and communities that had been forever changed by these senseless crimes. The scope of Petrov and Sullivan's collaboration was staggering in its geographic reach and duration, suggesting a level of planning and coordination that made their crimes even more horrifying. Dr. Sullivan was ultimately convicted on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to murder, and obstruction of justice. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, noting that his betrayal of the medical profession's trust made his crimes particularly heinous. At 81, the sentence was effectively a death penalty, ensuring that Sullivan would spend his remaining years behind bars. For the families of the victims, the trial's conclusion brought a mixture of relief and continued sorrow. Justice had finally been served, but it could not restore the lives that had been cut short or heal the wounds that had festered for decades. Arthur Fitzgerald died peacefully in his sleep just 6 months after the trial ended, his family finding comfort in knowing that he had lived to see his daughter's killer brought to justice. The Sarah Fitzgerald case became a landmark example of how modern forensic techniques could solve even the coldest of cases, inspiring law enforcement agencies across the country to re-examine their own unsolved murders using genetic genealogy. But perhaps more importantly, it served as a reminder that evil often hides behind facades of respectability and trust, and that the pursuit of truth and justice should never be abandoned, no matter how much time has passed.